so glad you're here tonight. I'm just lying here by the fire, feeling the warmth, getting ready to read you a Christmas story to help you relax and drift away. If you enjoy cozy nights like this, and you'd like to join me for more stories by the fireplace, remember to subscribe so you'll always have a warm place to return to. Now, let's begin. Prologue. Falling snow, the soft crackle of the fire, a whisper. Hello, my friend. So good to see you again tonight. I hope you're warm, safe, and ready to drift into a cozy story with me. If you'd like, you can close your eyes now and just imagine yourself lying here by the fire, listening to the snow falling gently outside. Tonight, I want to take you back to another time, to a quiet Christmas long ago, when the world moved a little slower, and the glow of a candle in the window was enough to make the night feel magical. Our story begins in the winter of 1958, in the rolling countryside of England, where the fields lay silent under a blanket of snow, and the only sound was the gentle hush of the wind. Chapter 1. The journey. Margaret pressed her forehead lightly against the cold window of the train carriage, watching the frosted hills slide slowly past, snowflakes stuck to the glass, melting in tiny rivulets before vanishing into mist. Inside the carriage, it was warm and dim, the brass lamps glowing softly as passengers sat bundled in coats and scarves, lost in their own thoughts. The steady rhythm of the train, clack, 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 was like a lullaby, and Margaret let her eyes close for just a moment. She thought of the small cottage waiting for her, tucked away at the edge of the woods, with smoke rising from its chimney and a Christmas wreath hanging on its door. As the train curved along the tracks, the conductor's voice called gently down the corridor, "Next stop, Ashford Village." Ashford Village. Margaret smiled. That was her stop. She gathered her suitcase, wrapped her scarf a little tighter, and prepared to step out into the crisp night air. The platform was nearly empty when she arrived, just a lantern glowing faintly at the far end, a station master humming quietly to himself, and the soft crunch of snow under her boots. She took a deep breath. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. Her journey had begun. The path to the Christmas cottage was waiting. Chapter 2. The cottage. Margaret's boots crunched softly along the snowy lane as she left the little station behind. The village was quiet. Only a few warm lights glowed from windows where families gathered, and the gentle hush of snow seemed to cover every sound. She carried her small suitcase carefully, her scarf pulled close against the cold. With every step, her breath drifted in little clouds before fading into the night. At the bend in the lane, she saw it. Her Christmas cottage. It was just as she remembered. A small stone house, its roof blanketed in white, smoke curling gently from the chimney. A wreath of holly and red ribbon hung upon the door, and candlelight flickered softly through the windows. When she pushed open the wooden gate, it creaked faintly, as though greeting her. The path had been brushed clear of snow, almost as if the cottage itself had been waiting for her return. Inside, the air was warm, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. She set her suitcase down beside the door, slipped off her gloves, and pressed her cold hands near the fire that glowed bright in the hearth. The crackle and pop of burning logs filled the room with a comforting rhythm. On the table near the window, she found a small surprise, a basket wrapped in red cloth, filled with bread, cheese, and a little jar of cranberry jam. A note lay tucked inside, written in neat handwriting. "Welcome home, Miss Margaret. Merry Christmas." It was signed simply, "From the villagers." She smiled to herself, her heart warming more quickly than her hands by the fire. The cottage felt alive with kindness. promise of quiet nights, gentle mornings, and perhaps a little touch of Christmas magic. That night, Margaret sat curled in the armchair, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, listening to the snow fall outside. Each flake seemed to soften the world further, until it was only her, the fire, and the gentle hum of Christmas waiting to unfold. Chapter 3. The Village Market. The next morning, Margaret awoke to the soft light of winter sunshine spilling across her quilt. She could hear the faint distant bells of the church ringing, their sound carrying gently through the still, snowy air. After a warm cup of tea and a piece of buttered bread, she wrapped herself in her wool coat, tied her scarf snugly, and set off toward the village square. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she followed the narrow path, lined with hedgerows dusted white. Children hurried past her, their cheeks pink from the cold, their laughter echoing like tiny bells. In the distance, she could hear the murmur of voices and the faint notes of a violin playing a Christmas carol. When she reached the square, her heart lifted. The village market was alive with light and colour. Lanterns hung from wooden stalls, glowing against the pale sky. Tables were piled with roasted chestnuts, sugared almonds, mince pies, and jars of golden honey. The sweet scent of cinnamon and mulled cider drifted through the air. Merchants called out softly, offering handmade toys, knitted scarves, and carved wooden ornaments. One elderly man stood by his stall of candles, each one dipped by hand and glowing faintly, as though carrying a secret warmth inside. Margaret wandered slowly, savouring every sound, every detail. She pauses to listen to a group of children singing carols, their voices pure and bright, rising into the crisp morning air. She dropped a small coin into their basket, and one little girl smiled up at her, whispering, "Merry Christmas, miss." At another stall, she found a book of poems bound in red leather. The seller, a kind woman with silver hair, pressed it into her hands. "Take it, dear," she said softly. "It feels as though it belongs with you." Margaret held the book close to her heart. There was something magical in the air that morning. Something beyond the market stalls and the food and the music. It was as if the entire village was wrapped in one great, gentle spirit of kindness. As the afternoon light faded, she walked slowly back toward the cottage, her basket full of small treasures, her heart full of warmth. The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes settling on her coat, reminding her that Christmas Eve was drawing near. Chapter 4. An Unexpected Guest. The snow was falling heavily now, each flake catching the light of the lanterns as Margaret made her way back to the cottage. By the time she reached the door, her coat was dusted white, and her cheeks glowed with the sting of cold air. Inside, the cottage welcomed her like an old friend. She set her basket of treasures on the table, lit a single candle in the window, and settled by the fire with the red leather book of poems she had found at the market. The firelight flickered against the pages as she read softly to herself, the words melting into the crackle of the wood. Hours slipped by unnoticed. Outside, the storm deepened, the wind brushing against the shutters, carrying with it the hush of falling snow. Margaret was just beginning to drift into a doze when she heard it. 3 gentle knocks at the door. Startled, she rose and crossed the room. Few ever came to the cottage at night, especially in weather such as this. She lifted the latch and pulled the door open. Standing there, half covered in snow, was a man she had never seen before. His coat was worn, his scarf tattered, and he carried a small case slung over his shoulder. His eyes, however, were kind. Tired, but kind. "Good evening," he said softly, his voice nearly carried away by the wind. I seem to have lost my way. The snow came down faster than I expected. Might I trouble you for a little warmth?" Margaret hesitated only a heartbeat before stepping aside. "Of course. Please come in." The man entered with a grateful nod, brushing snow from his coat. As he warmed his hands by the fire, Margaret noticed the small case he carried was not luggage, but a guitar. "You play?" she asked gently. He smiled faintly. "I do, or at least, I try. I was meant to play at the market tonight, but the snow had other plans." Margaret poured him a cup of tea and set a piece of bread with jam on the table. The man thanked her, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the warm cup. As the firelight bathed the room in gold, the little cottage felt fuller, warmer. There was something comforting about the presence of another soul, a reminder that Christmas was not meant to be spent alone. When he finished his tea, the man opened the case and drew out the guitar. "May I?" he asked quietly. Margaret nodded, her heart already knowing that this moment would be one she would carry with her forever. And as the storm raged outside, the soft, gentle strains of music began to fill the Christmas cottage, weaving magic into the air. Chapter 5. Christmas Eve by the fire. The guitar's notes lingered in the air like falling snowflakes, delicate and timeless. Margaret leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, letting the music wrap around her like another blanket. The man played softly at first, gentle tunes that seemed to echo the hush of the storm outside. Then he shifted into something brighter, a melody that reminded Margaret of carolers in the village square, of candles glowing in windows, of laughter spilling from doorways on a cold December night. When he finished, he looked almost shy. "It isn't much," he whispered, "but music has a way of keeping the cold away, don't you think?" Margaret smiled warmly. "It's more than enough. It feels like Christmas itself has stepped into this room." They shared a quiet meal, bread, cheese, and a few roasted chestnuts Margaret had saved from the market. The fire crackled gently, filling the silences with its comforting rhythm. Between bites, they began to talk. The man told her his name was Thomas. He had been travelling from town to town, playing music wherever he could, carrying with him only his guitar and a small satchel of belongings. He spoke of kind strangers who had offered him shelter, of snowy nights spent playing to quiet taverns, and of a dream that one day he might write songs that people would remember. Margaret shared her own story, her days as a teacher in a nearby town, her love of books, and her fondness for this little cottage where she came each Christmas to rest and reflect. She told him how the villagers always made her feel welcome, how she never felt truly alone here, even in the stillness of winter. As the evening deepened, Thomas tuned his guitar again and played familiar carols. Margaret hummed along softly, her voice barely more than a whisper, but together the two of them filled the small cottage with music that seemed to glow as brightly as the fire. At one point, Thomas set the guitar aside and leaned forward, his voice thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? How two paths can cross in the middle of a snowstorm, as if it were always meant to be." Margaret nodded. "Christmas has a way of bringing people together, sometimes in the most unexpected ways." They both fell quiet, listening to the wind outside. Snowflakes tapped gently against the window, and the world beyond seemed far away, hushed and hidden under a soft weight of sleep pressing down just yet. The warmth of the fire, the music, and the presence of another heart had filled the little cottage with a rare and precious magic, the kind that only Christmas Eve can bring. Chapter 6. Midnight Snow. Walk the fire had burned low, its embers glowing like tiny stars in the hearth. Outside, the storm had gentled into silence, leaving the world blanketed in deep, untouched snow. The clock on the mantel ticked softly, its hands nearing midnight. Margaret rose and peered through the frosted window. "The storm has passed," she whispered. "The night looks so still." Thomas set aside his guitar and joined her, gazing out into the moonlit woods. The snow shimmered under the silver light, every branch draped in white, every shadow softened. It was as though the whole world had been transformed into a dream. "Shall we?" he asked softly, a glimmer of childlike wonder in his eyes. Margaret hesitated only a moment before nodding. She pulled her scarf around her shoulders once more, and together they stepped into the night. The cold greeted them sharply, but it was clean, crisp, and filled with the kind of silence that carried its own music. Their boots sank into the snow, each step leaving a clear, perfect imprint. They followed the path through the trees, their breath rising in clouds before fading into the moonlight. The woods were hushed, but not empty. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called softly. The branches above seemed to whisper as the slightest breeze stirred them. At one clearing, they paused. The snow stretched out before them like a silver sea, and in the centre stood a tall pine, its branches heavy with white. From somewhere unseen, the faint sound of bells drifted through the air, so faint that Margaret wondered if it was only in her imagination. "Do you hear that?" she asked quietly. Thomas tilted his head, smiling softly. "Yes, it's as if Christmas itself is ringing through the trees." For a moment, they simply stood together, breathing in the stillness. The moonlight bathed their faces, and the world around them seemed to pause, as though holding its breath in reverence on their way back to the cottage. Thomas began to hum a tune, soft, steady, almost like a lullaby. Margaret joined him, her voice barely above the wind, and together their whispers of song carried gently through the snowy night. When they reached the cottage once more, Margaret glanced back at the woods. The path they had walked was already fading under new snow, as though the night wished to keep their secret. Inside, they shook the cold from their coats, their cheeks glowing from the winter air. The fire welcomed them with its golden warmth, and as they settled once again into the little room, Margaret felt her heart full in a way it hadn't been for many years. This Christmas was already unlike any she had known before. Chapter 7. Christmas Morning. Margaret awoke to the soft golden light of morning spilling through the curtains. For a moment she lay still, listening. The cottage was quiet, except for the faint pop and sigh of the fire still glowing in the hearth. Outside, the bells of the village church began to ring, their tones slow and steady, drifting across the snowy fields. She rose quietly, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. At the window, she drew back the curtain and gasped softly. The world outside was dazzling. Snow covered every rooftop, every branch, every stone fence. Smoke curled from chimneys, and in the distance she could see children already bundled in scarves, tugging sleds toward the hill. The sound of soft footsteps chime of bells. Margaret joined him softly, her voice weaving with his, until it felt as though the little room itself was singing. Later, they walked together into the village. The square was alive with laughter and music. Children threw snowballs, families gathered in doorways, and carolers sang beneath the great Christmas tree that stood tall in the centre. When the villagers saw Margaret, they greeted her warmly, pressing her hands, wishing her joy. Some glanced curiously at Thomas, but when he lifted his guitar and began to play, their smiles grew wide. Soon the square was filled with song, voices rising together, carrying into the cold winter sky. Margaret stood beside him, her heart swelling with gratitude. She thought of the quiet cottage, the storm, the unexpected knock on the door, and how everything had changed in a single night. As the day unfolded, filled with laughter and music, she realised that this Christmas was not only about snow or firesides or even tradition. It was about connection, the simple, unlooked-for gift of finding another soul to share the moment with. That evening, as the sky turned a deep blue and lanterns glowed once more in the windows, Margaret and Thomas walked back to the cottage side by side. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the air was still, carrying the last echoes of the bells. Inside, they lit the fire again. The flames leapt high, casting their glow across the room. Margaret curled into her chair, Thomas tuning his guitar one last time, and as he played softly, Margaret closed her eyes, letting the warmth, the music, and the magic of Christmas carry her into a gentle dream. Epilogue. The fire's last glow, the last log settled in the hearth, sending up a shower of sparks before fading into embers. The snow outside fell silently, endlessly, wrapping the cottage in stillness, and there, in the soft glow of firelight, the story of this Christmas lingered, woven into music, kindness, and the quiet wonder of hearts meeting on a snowy night. A Christmas